On today's Locked On Bucks, we move forward as the Bucks will now without Jericho Sims for roughly the next 4 weeks. We'll dig into what that means, take a look at the schedule and the help the Bucks did not receive last night in the Eastern Conference, and get you set for a very, very large 5-game road trip beginning tonight in San Francisco against the Warriors. Let's talk about all that coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, welcoming you onto the show. Thanks to everybody for making this your first listen of the day, all the everydayers out there, and to everybody checking out the Locked On Bucks podcast. You can sign up for that for free at lockedondaily.com and get your day started with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 off instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. It is a dark moment for the Bucks, who now lose another big for the interim here, and that is, of course, Jericho Sims. You go back to Sunday night before that game against the Oklahoma City Thunder when Doc Rivers was asked about it. And actually, let's go to Saturday where the injury occurred. Jericho Sims left the game briefly in the first half against the Pacers. And we did see lineups of Giannis and Kyle Kuzma at the 5 and the 4. And I remember thinking at the time, boy, we haven't seen a whole lot of this. As we would come to find out, it's likely because of that thumb injury that Jericho Sims suffered. But before the game Sunday against the Oklahoma City Thunder, Doc was asked about it and said it is a significant injury. And there are many considerations that are taking place, hinting at surgery and what that would potentially mean. I think we mentioned it a couple of times too. It did in some ways remind you of the Ryan Rollins conversation, in that, we heard earlier this season when Ryan Rollins had the shoulder issue, he's talking through the options if he does have surgery. I don't think Doc ever said this specifically, but reading between the lines with his tone and some other things said, if he has surgery, it may well end his season, and it's at least going to halt the progress that he's making. And you got the sense that was the same or similar conversation being had with Jericho Sims. The minutes that he was starting to carve out with this group here, and just the role that he was taking on initially, that was just giving the Bucks another big. You go back to early in the season, Bucks had 3 bigs on the roster, and you're starting 2 of them. So it limits how much you can stagger guys, what different types of looks you can throw out there. Kyle Kuzma's on board, and to some extent that does add things for the Bucks, at least gives them another option of another big to throw out there, or bigger player, I should say. But you really got in those 14 games a chance to see, okay, here's what it looks like to have another big to spell Brook Lopez, and somebody that plays much, much differently than Brook Lopez does. You look at the Jericho Sims numbers, and nothing really jumps off the page if we're just looking at the counting stats and in the back of the basketball card numbers. But the impact that he brought defensively, and again, I think the biggest piece was just being an additional body to be able to spell Brook Lopez, was really what stood out more than anything for the Bucks in those Jericho Sims minutes. So now it comes at a time where you still have 11 games left on the Bobby Portis suspension. And with Jericho Sims on the floor, the Bucks have been pretty good defensively. Obviously, the offense is where you have those concerns. It was just a 110 offensive rating, still very limited sample size in terms of the possessions that we're looking at, but they were an excellent defensive rebounding team with Jericho Sims out there. They were in the 97th percentile. Pretty good defense, as we mentioned, weren't fouling opponents. And again, I think that speaks to Jericho Sims' switchability, in that even in other lineups where you would lose a perimeter matchup, you didn't feel quite as comfortable switching at times, depending on the personnel that's out there. And if one guy loses their battle and gets into the paint, that's where the fouls occur. With Jericho Sims out there, you're switching a lot more. So you did not see that. It's it's going to be a big blow for the Bucks because I think the hope is the more you were seeing of Jericho Sims, you can use him as a guy to spell Brook Lopez and give Brook Lopez some additional rest, or at least take some minutes off of that workload there. I don't want to get into the Brook Lopez conversation again over and over. You know how I feel. You know how Camille feels. You know how Frank feels about Brook Lopez. The numbers that we're going to point to back up how we feel about that. I get it. Not everybody else is aligned. And you may think Brook Lopez is not effective or not good. We're going to agree to disagree. But I think we all agree on the fact that you would love to get Brook Lopez some downtime and some rest and shave off some of those minutes going into the playoffs here for Lopez. And, with Jericho Sims' arrival, we started to see slightly that Brook, the remarkable part, was playing 34 minutes a game in November through those 14 games. That went down to about 31 and a half in December, 31 and a half in January. Now it's dropped down to about 30. I'd still like to see that number down in the 28, 27 and use more of that for the postseason. But the point is, you don't have that option now with Jericho Sims gone and Bobby Portis out for 11 more games. So what does this mean for how the Bucks are going to move forward and some of the schedule that they have in front? I do want to take a look at that coming up. I also want to take a look at some of the games that were played last night and some of the variance swings that we've continued to see in the standings and what these minutes mean what these games mean for the Bucks as they continue to fight it out for playoff seeding. So we'll start to move closer and closer into those conversations coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. Again, Bobby Portis, you're still playing without him for 11 games now. That's going to be the challenge. But what does it mean with the opponents that the Bucks have on the schedule? I don't want to say catch a break, but is it not quite as bad as it would have been with these games immediately this week? We'll start to take a look at that coming up next. When it comes to grocery shopping and meal planning, I've had this ongoing problem. I just don't have the time between work, life, and trying to eat healthier. You're constantly feeling stressed out. You go to the grocery store, you buy things you don't need, and then you end up with no time to actually cook. Sticking to your health goals, that is always a struggle as well. But everything changes when you discover Hungry Root. It'll be a game changer. It's the easiest way to eat healthy without all of the stress. With Hungry Root, it's like having a personal shopper and a nutritionist all in one. They take care of your grocery shopping, recommending meals and groceries based on your tastes and health goals, from anti-inflammatory to high protein and gluten-free options. The best part is every meal is ready in 15 minutes or less. Quick, healthy meals that actually taste great, all delivered directly to your door. It'll be a huge time saver and make healthy eating so much simpler. You're going to love Hungry Root. Go for a limited time. Get 50% off. 40% off, I beg your pardon. So for a limited time, 40% off your first box and a free item for life in that box. Just go to hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA. hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA. Code LockedOnNBA for 40% off that first box. Don't miss out. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all of my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you just stop managing your money and start building wealth. When you start using Monarch, you'll realize how much you were spending on food delivery and allow you to budget even smarter and more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. And managing money with your partner is smoother, now more so than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts. You can set goals and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. All right, so this schedule that the Bucks have, again, it starts tonight against the Golden State Warriors. Now, you don't look at the Warriors and look at them as a big team. Jimmy Butler at times has been playing the 4 for that team. They're throwing lineups out there with Jimmy Butler and Draymond Green in your front court. Spacing is certainly an issue. And this is one of those matchups where you really would have loved to have seen Jericho Sims to have that switchability, not necessarily just on Steph Curry, but on all of those types of guys for the Warriors, especially if they're going to play small. That's out the window now. I do want to point back to the wording of the press release that the Bucks sent out yesterday about Jericho Sims, in that the surgery was performed yesterday, so Monday in New York. So Jericho Sims, after that game against the Thunder, immediately went to New York to get this surgery taken care of. He injured his thumb in Saturday's win over Indiana. He is expected to be sidelined for approximately 4 weeks with a likely return for the playoffs. The Warriors, as we mentioned, you would have loved to have had him for his versatility on the perimeter. But once you get outside of that, the Lakers are continuing to be banged up and without size, and the Bucks are going to be facing the Lakers without LeBron James. That's another back-to-back for the Lakers. Who knows? You may not have Luka Doncic either. We saw last time it was Alex Len that they had to throw out there as their big. Sacramento Kings brought in Jonas Valanciunas. That's their big. The Suns have been a total disaster. Now that we say that, we're setting ourselves up for the Suns to start to figure things out against the Bucks. But you got 2 games against the Suns. You got a game left against the Nuggets where you will need some size. And I'm not saying Jericho Sims would have been a Nikola Jokic stopper, but you would love to have more bodies to throw at Nikola Jokic. Not just Jericho Sims. You'd love to have Bobby Portis back as well. That's not going to be the case here. So it's not going to be until that game, Tuesday, April 8th, against the Minnesota Timberwolves, where Bobby Portis makes his return. So you look at the games where you'll have Bobby Portis back. That would be the Timberwolves game, your final game against the Pelicans at home, and then those 2 huge games against the Detroit Pistons. The time of this surgery for Jericho Sims, we saw roughly 4 weeks. That would take us to April 18th, I believe, or April 14th would be 4 weeks out from the surgery, which would fall in line with the week that the Bucks are going to have off going into the playoffs. I say that knowing, look, is the play-in tournament still a possibility? Sure. But as we've talked about many times, you're not catching the Knicks. I think a couple of things. The loss to the Thunder, the loss to the Orlando Magic, not capitalizing there. The Knicks winning last night. You're 5 games back in the loss column with an additional game to make up by way of not having the tiebreaker, and there's 15 games remaining. Outplaying the Knicks by 6 games over the course of 15 games, it's not happening. So having said that, you're 7 games up out of the play-in tournament spot. If it's challenging to make up 5, 7 is even more difficult. So it is going to be 4, 5, or 6 for the Bucks. So you do get that week off in between the regular season ending and the playoffs beginning. That's going to line up with this 4-week takeaway, or with this 4-week timeline for Jericho Sims, and potentially getting back on the floor. But again, you go back to some of that wording, approximately 4 weeks, a likely return for the playoffs. I do take away from that, at least you provide that nugget. I mean, you go back to the Giannis injury and last year, where it was hopeful quite a bit. Chris Middleton, countless times we heard hope. We hope this, hopeful for this. They at least didn't use that word. So I do think there's a very, very strong chance we're going to see Jericho Sims ready for the playoffs. But the challenge is discovering more lineups that you could have used. And I think the big conversation, which I didn't necessarily plan for this show, but it's certainly one we can start to get into in the final segment, is you do wonder if the starting five is still a work in progress in what you're seeing, because we keep harping on the offensive issues that this Bucks team has had, specifically in the fourth quarter. They're still last in fourth quarter efficiency, 30th in the NBA, tied with the Brooklyn Nets. But again, not a neighborhood you want to live in. They're pretty good on the defensive end in fourth quarters, but not enough to offset where their offense has been. Now, if we look at since the All-Star break, it's much better, but it's still around the middle of the pack where they are offensively. And this is a team with Giannis and Damian Lillard. You can't not only be sitting there as a whole, you can't be there in the fourth quarter. Not to put unfair pressure on Dame or have greater expectations than we should, but you brought in Damian Lillard to give you that edge in fourth quarters that you have not had in the past. And it's not just Dame. It's up and down the list that you go through with this roster. The shooting numbers have just fallen off in the fourth quarter. Dame is below 30% shooting on three. Everybody on this group really below their season average in the fourth quarter. And that's the biggest issue that this team is running into, is you can continue to play defense. And I go back to that series against the Celtics really in 2022, in that, look, defense travels. You're going to go up against some luck in the playoffs, but it's typically not, man, a team had some shooting luck, or luck may be the wrong word to use, hotness. This team was hot shooting the ball, and it carried through for 7 games. Like, that typically doesn't happen. You can get hot for 3 or 4 games, but it's typically not 7. That's why we keep talking about defense and where this defense needs to be, and how you continue to hear mention teams that win the title always have a top 10 defense because your defense travels throughout the postseason. But you need that clutch play, and that's something that's just evaded the Bucks so far this season for whatever reason. It hasn't been there. Starting lineup doesn't necessarily speak to the fourth quarter, but the offense, as a whole, is not where we anticipated this group to be. They were knocking on the door of a top 5 offense a year ago. Now, the defense was disastrous, but the offense was what you expected from this Bucks group. I believe 6th is where they finished. They're 14th right now in offensive efficiency, behind the Dallas Mavericks. Now, maybe they catch the Mavs. Maybe they catch the Houston Rockets because of the injuries that Dallas is dealing with. But you got to be well inside of the top 10 with Giannis and Damian Lillard on this roster. They're just outside of the top 10 defensively as well. And you keep going back to the starting lineup and wondering, does this make sense for the Bucks? So I do actually want to get into that briefly. I mentioned the standings too. The Bucks got no help there. The Pacers win a game last night on an Obi Toppin heavily contested corner three-pointer. So the Indiana Pacers steal victory last night in a huge, huge game against the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Pistons steamrolled the New Orleans Pelicans, and your opponent tonight also lost on night 1 of a back-to-back. So as we open things up here today, Bucks are still 4th, but you're tied in terms of record with the Pacers. And the Pistons have matched you in wins and are 2 back in the loss column. So we'll take a look at what the numbers say for how these standings are going to shake out for the Bucks and the rest of those teams. And that conversation that I mentioned before as well about starting lineup. Is it time to look at potential changes to that starting lineup? We'll get into that conversation coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our next sponsor here, our friends over at Prize Picks, who bring you today's show as well. With Prize Picks, basketball season heating up, no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks. It's the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick just more or less. All you need to do is pick those 2 options on at least 2 player stat projections for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. It's easy to use and available in over 30 states, and it lets you mix and match projections across different sports. This week, maybe you want to target Giannis for more than 25 points. Jason Tatum for more than 8 rebounds, or Luka Doncic for more than 7 assists in these upcoming games. Prize Picks makes it simple. You can set your lineup in less than 60 seconds and stay engaged all game long. When you win, your money hits your account in as little as 15 minutes. No waiting around. And every Tuesday, which is today, Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25%, giving even more value to your lineup. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 off instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
All right, the latest here in terms of what we're seeing in the standings. So I mentioned the Pistons and Pacers both won last night. The latest projections. So let's rewind to Saturday. After the Bucks beat the Pacers, the Bucks had a 52% chance at getting the 4 seed. So you were 1 game up on Indiana at that time, and you had the tiebreaker, essentially 2 games up. So you moved from a 33% chance of the 4 seed to a 52% chance by way of that win. After Sunday night and last night, that 52% chance has dropped down to 37%, and the Pacers have moved up to a 53% chance for 4th in the Eastern Conference. So the numbers right now suggesting Indiana will be the 4 seed, and the Bucks have a 39% chance at the 5 seed, suggesting you're going to be the 5 seed. The Pistons still have far and away the most difficult schedule of those 3 teams. 7th most difficult schedule left in all of the NBA do the Detroit Pistons have. Now, Bucks and Pacers have both dropped down close to the top 10. Right now, remember, for the longest time, we were talking about the Bucks have the 5th most difficult schedule. You've started to get a lot of those out of the way. You're done with the Cavs. You're done with the Celtics. You're done with the Thunder. Still got this 5-game West Coast road trip. But again, Suns, not where you expected them to be when those games were put on the schedule. The Sixers have waved the white flag. They shut down Paul George for the season. You got 1 game left with the Sixers. Miami Heat, I don't know if they're quiet quitting, but they did get an 8-game losing streak for the first time under Eric Spoelstra in that loss to the Knicks last night. You got a game left with Miami. So you're starting to get these games pop up, and 2 with the Pelicans, which, again, you go back to January, we said at the time, man, when those were pushed back, or when that was pushed back to late April, this is potentially a big break for the Bucks. That it's a Pels team that was down there in the standings. Not that they were any better or much better at the time of the originally scheduled date for that game, but pushing it that far back just meant there's an impetus for Zion Williamson to be shut down and the Pels to just go into let's play for draft picks here. So you got those 2 the final week of the regular season. The schedule has started to swing now for the Bucks, but you have to take advantage of that. And quite frankly, look, even with the news we started this show on, the injury to Jericho Sims, the fact that Bobby Portis still isn't available and won't be available until April 8th, I still think you have to approach this road trip needing 3 wins, right? You got the Suns on there. You're catching the Warriors on night 2 of a back-to-back. You got the Sacramento Kings, who on paper, you are a better team than the Sacramento Kings. You need to go into these games expecting to win. If the Bucks do, in fact, finish 5th in the standings, I still think who cares? And we're seeing a lot of chatter in the standings about what's the right approach that you have to have. Do we need to scale things down here and not have these championship expectations and aspirations? And certainly the numbers would start to suggest that for the Bucks. I still think the difference between this year and last year is this. Last year, through it all, you had numbers that could back up if you were fully in on this team and thought teams are sleeping on this Bucks team. I believe they're going to make some noise in the playoffs. And I think a lot of us were there right around this time a year ago when you think back to that win at home against the Oklahoma City Thunder and how the Bucks just dominated them. That was what I think March 24th, and they were starting to piece together very good offense and look much better. The defense was improved, I should say. Much better from where it was at 23rd in the league. It eventually kind of settled in at the midpoint in the league, but you were starting to see these things that started to suggest, I believe in this team. The record against teams in the top 10, their net rating in teams against, or in games against teams in the top 10 as well. The fact that their 5-man starting lineup was, I believe, the best 5-man grouping by the numbers in net rating in the league. Like one by one, you had these things you could point to and say, I believe in this team. I believe they're going to be able to get it done. You had just as many things that you could point to on the opposite and say, well, there's actually this. And certainly the defense was a big piece of that. But it was much more balanced last year. This year, quite frankly, that has not been the case. And I think that's the big challenge is you look at the Bucks record against those top 3 teams in their conference. Certainly we're all well aware of it at this time. 0-9 against the Cavaliers, the Celtics, and the New York Knicks. If you want to lump in the Western Conference too, you're 0-2 against the Oklahoma City Thunder. You split with the Houston Rockets. You've taken one with the Denver Nuggets. Maybe you split with the Nuggets. Maybe you split with the Lakers. You're 0-2 with the Grizzlies. You're potentially 0-2 with the Warriors. So we're talking about in those 12 games against the top 6 teams in the Western Conference, potentially going 3-9, so what, you could go 0-10 against the top 3 in the East, and then against the playoff teams not playing in the West, 3-9. Like if we're talking about a 3-19 against those caliber teams, that again is markedly different from where it was a season ago. So I think that's the challenge, but I still am going to have a hard time just completely writing off a team that has Giannis and Damian Lillard in the postseason, warts and all. And I'm acknowledging all the warts that we've seen on this group so far this season. You'd be crazy to say straight up, would you take the Bucks or Cavaliers in a best-of-7 series? Would you take the Bucks or the Celtics in a best-of-7 series? I think we're starting to push it with the Knicks. I still have questions there, and certainly with all the teams behind you there. But those 2 teams, that's going to be the tough part. And the reality is you're going to have to go through both of those teams to get out of the Eastern Conference. That's the challenge of what's left here for the Bucks so far this season. And that's why the very few remaining games you have against those caliber teams are so important. Obviously, the Pistons games are the most important games left this season for the Bucks. But when you look at that one game left against the Knicks, we talked about that Cavs game, 10 days ago, being, hey, this is a good litmus test. You got your new players in tow. It's a different team. You've been playing much better. The last time you really played the Cavs, I'm not going to include the third game because nobody played in that game for the Bucks coming out of the NBA Cup. But take that out of the mix. The last time you played the Cavs, it was during your 2-8 start. It was all the way back in November. So a lot has changed. Let's see how this group looks with those games now. And you came up short. So that Knicks game is certainly a pretty big barometer for this Bucks team to see how do we stack up against this Knicks team, which again, you're probably going to catch without Jalen Brunson. And that's another reason why this schedule has started to turn now for the Bucks. That game, the 2 Pistons games, and this West Coast road trip of your 15 games remaining, those are the big ones. So those are 8 of your 15 games. And, quite frankly, I think you have to have the expectation of 6-2 in those 8 games. If you can do that, doesn't offset everything that you've done before this, the previous 67 games, doesn't take away your 0-9 record against, as of this moment, against the Cavs, the Celtics, and the Knicks. It doesn't take away that record against the teams in the top. But it starts to build some positive momentum for this group going into a spot where they need it most in the playoffs. And again, this schedule, this West Coast trip, it's always been a challenge for the Bucks for whatever reason. But when you factor in LeBron James is not going to be playing, that Phoenix Suns team, maybe there's some added motivation. Maybe Mike Budenholzer draws up some plays we haven't seen before. And the Suns strike some revenge there for Bud. But that's a Suns team that certainly looks like they're ready for the season to be over. The Kings, again, after that hot start they made after the coaching change, that's a team that's really started to cool off and fall back to earth. So the point is there are winnable games that this Bucks team has on this West Coast road trip. And even tonight, you can factor in there as well with night 2 of a back-to-back for an older Golden State Warriors team. So if you can come out of this 5-game trip at the very least 3-2, and then get those other games, the Knicks game, starting with that, you're going to put yourself in a much, much better spot going into that final week in the matchup with the Detroit Pistons. Because look, mention the Pistons 7th most difficult schedule left. 2 games left with the Bucks, 1 game left with the Timberwolves, 1 game left with the Grizzlies, 1 game apiece with the Cavs and the Thunder. So there's a lot of challenges out there for the Detroit Pistons. I still think they're going to finish 6th. And if the Bucks are 5th, if they're 4th, I get home court advantage and the supposed importance of that we're seeing more and more teams win on the road in the playoffs. As we've seen, health is the biggest thing. I'm not going to fret over seeding for the Bucks. If you tell me they're fully healthy and they're the 6th seed, fine, I'll take it. I think that's where most of us are at as of this moment. A couple of calls to let's dig into the Damian Lillard numbers. I do want to do that. I think it deserves much more of a discussion than just a 5-minute segment or so. So I want to take a look at Dame's numbers and just overall these groupings, because one thing we did not get to that I teased was the starting lineup. Is it time to look for a change there? I do wonder if part of the offensive struggles that we're seeing is parts of that starting lineup, and it's not for the reason that I think we've all fallen on in the 2-guard spot. So I think that's a much lengthier discussion, and the Dame impact in the 4th quarter that we'll get to not on tomorrow's show. We're going to be recapping hopefully a win in San Francisco against the Warriors, but our show for Thursday as we get set for that Lakers game, I do want to get into that, and maybe we'll have more to back up some things that we saw in terms of the starting 5, offensive pairings, and Damian Lillard's numbers in the 4th quarter. So certainly a much larger discussion that we'll get into here in the coming days there. Solo shows Camille under the weather today, so thanks for bearing through this with me as we get set for a big 5-game road trip. Camille and I are going to have the post game tomorrow. So 9:00 tip tomorrow. And that, I suppose we should point out, the post game for both the Warriors and the Lakers games are going to be the following morning, since it's so late and my radio duties aren't going to end until at least 1 a.m., probably later. So we're going to do live post-game shows to get your reaction to those games and share our thoughts on what we saw. So that'll be tomorrow morning and Friday morning, recapping the Warriors and the Lakers games, and then the offense discussion. And Damian Lillard, we'll squeeze that in on Thursday and potentially even more so next week as well. Leave your thoughts on the comments, not only the most important games that the Bucks have left, this 5-game road trip. What is the non-negotiable record for the Bucks? Where do they have to finish coming out of these 5 games? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and we'll get to those coming up in our next shows as well. That'll do it for today. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.